Hi, this is Jeff at Slavens Racing. This video is about how to change fork springs on WP closed cartridge forks. Those forks first came out in '07 on the SX models, and then in '08 on the XCs, and they're currently still on the XCs and the SX and SXF models. Closed chamber fork. So the tools that you need to do this are a 17mm open end wrench, 19mm socket and ratchet, and then you'll need a special tool to remove the fork cap, and this slot will be used later. We'll show you how to do that. So first thing you need to do is loosen this top cap, and if you don't have soft jaws to put your forks into to do that, you can do it on the bike before you remove the forks. The forks do have to be removed in order to do this procedure because the springs are in the bottom of the fork. So, but while the forks are still on the bike, you could loosen the pinch bolts on the triple clamp, and then put the wrench on here and just loosen it up. And you can just loosen it a half a turn, and that will be enough. So once you've loosened that, then you've got to work on the other end of the fork. But first, maybe we should talk about what type of fork you have, because guys get confused. Open or closed chamber forks, which is what we're working on today, have these 4 slots, and they require this big wrench to go on here. If you have a open chamber fork, it will have 4 pinholes. It requires a different tool, or it will have just a 24mm head on it that requires a 24mm wrench or socket. We're not working on those today. We're working on closed chamber. They require this tool, and they have 4 slots. That's closed chamber. From there, you turn the fork upside down, because you have to loosen this 19mm here. And I've got one here that's already loosened to speed up the process for this video. And I've already loosened this, and you need to loosen it with your ratchet. Do not use air impact guns and spin this quickly, because when you do that, it will loosen the nut on the opposite end of this. This is hooked onto the main spindle that holds the rebound valving. So the rebound stack is on the opposite end of this, and there's a nut that holds it there, and they're not that tight from the factory. And it's got a triangular shaped shim, and if that nut loosens at all, that shim will rotate, and it will block off the ports on the valving piston. So do not buzz this out with an air gun. Do it by hand with a ratchet and a socket. You can clamp it in the vise right here, across here. Do not clamp it this way, do not clamp down here or any other place on the fork. You can clamp across there, that's it. Once you've loosened that up all the way, because the springs are in there, the springs are pulling down on this piece, so you've got to push down on this in order to get to the next step. And the next step is to use this tool, the same tool we used to remove the cap, or loosen the cap, and we're going to use this slot over the spindle. There's other tools for doing that we sell. I don't have them here, but they're just basically like a little tuning fork. We've got those on our website as well. This is a factory one that I use. But this multi-tool has everything. It's got the top, the wrench to loosen the nut on the top, and then it's got the spindle slot, and it's got these devices for getting inside of the cartridge if you decide to go that far. So the next step is to push this down, and take quite a bit of pressure, and you slide this over, and then you slide that like that. And now this is held up, and the reason we want it that way is so that we can put our open end 17 on here and the ratchet with the socket here and loosen this up. So you just take this all the way out. I'm not going to do a reverse on how to put this back together, because you reverse the procedure that I'm doing now. But you would want to loosen this all the way before you put it back on, and that is counterclockwise. Loosen it all the way, and then when you screw it back on. Also, you need to make sure that this nut is all the way down. There's not a lot of threads exposed now. There's a lot more threads, so screw it down farther. Anyhow, so in order to continue taking this apart, we're going to push back down on the fork, pull this piece off. Now the fork's ready to come apart. So at this point, on this end up here, you're going to loosen this, the piece that you loosened earlier, and then screw it all the way. And then you can just push the outer fork tube down. Now that's the inner cartridge. We've got a separate video on how to service that if you so choose to do so. At this point, just pull out the cartridge, and here's your spring. Because the forks use a volume, there's no way to measure it from the top down like you do an open chambers fork. So because there's a volume measurement, you measure it out in cc's or ounces like I mentioned earlier, in a beaker like this, or some other measuring device that you have. And because of that, this has to be completely empty. If it's not, then the amount that you're putting in is going to overfill it. So this should be turned upside down for 30 minutes before you put the fork back together. So just lean it against the wall into a tray or something and let it drip for 30 minutes. You can see, you can also kind of stroke it because the fork oil gets trapped between the outer tube and the inner tube. That's where all the oil is that we're trying to get out. So let that sit for 30 minutes and drain. So now, in order to change the spring, it's just as simple as pulling them off and taking your new springs and sliding them back on. One exception is I always like to know what the total spring length is. And by total spring length, I mean the length of the spring plus any spacers that are involved. So you can see there's a plastic spacer here. This fork has one in it. Some of them have two or three. They have maybe a thick one and a couple of thin ones. When springs are wound, they don't always come out at the exact same length. You know, there's a variance by 2 or 3 millimeters, so they make it up with preload spacers. Guys see that and they think, wow, the factory screwed up and preloaded one fork more than they did the other one. Well, no, they did not. The springs were different length and they were correcting that. So the factory spec on this is 492 millimeters. The springs are 485 millimeters. That's the spec for the spring that these forks are supposed to use, 485, but the overall length is supposed to be 492. And I run them anywhere from 488 to 492 depending on what I'm trying to do, how I'm trying to make the bike handle. So there is some variance there, but the factory spec is 492. So you would just take a tape measure, a metric tape measure, which you can buy at Home Depot, and measure from the bottom of the spring up here to the end of the plastic washer, end of the preload spacer. And that measurement is supposed to be 492. If you have it there, then you've got approximately 5 millimeters of preload on the fork spring when it's all assembled. So after you've determined that, and you've put your new springs on there, then you can just reverse the process that I just showed you. This just slides back in the fork. And I usually just tighten this down a few turns. Then I turn the fork back upside down and I put that bolt back on it with the adjuster in it and tighten that back down. I don't have a torque spec for you on that. If you're a torqueaholic, you can look that up. And then after you've got this assembled down here, you've got this locked together with the other piece. I'll just briefly go over that. So push back down on this, hold it up, and then you screw this down. But first this nut needs to be threaded down further. And you put this on, lock those together, then take your holder out, and then tighten this down. Then you're ready to flip the fork over and put the oil in the opposite end. So the oil goes in this end. You'll unscrew this again and pour the oil in here in just this small area here. That's pretty much all there is to it. All WP forks use 5-weight oil. You can use whatever brand you want. Don't email and ask me. Use whatever in hell you want to use. But it's all 5-weight, or 85-150 is the correct designation on it. That's all for now.